Welcome to the second module of the course on Indian economy, policy and environment. In this module, we will be discussing about planning in India, and this is the first unit of the module where we will be discussing planning for development. I am Professor Joydeep Barua, Director at the School of Social Sciences, K.K. Hendik State Open University. In our earlier module, we have discussed about different approaches to development and also about different measures and indicators of development. In my first video, we have discussed about the role of institutions in economic development. We have discussed the role of state. We have also discussed the role of market and role of community in terms of social norms and customs, which go to affect and also influence the overall setting and outcome of economic performances. Now, when we try to see that what is the role of state, then the question obviously comes that how does a state intervene in the economy? And that one area where we can discuss the idea of economic planning, and that is planning for development. And this is where this module will try to locate our discussion, and we will try to see how state can intervene in the economic sphere and also try to influence the development outcomes of a particular state, particular country, particular community. The India experimented with economic planning for more than 6 decades now, and therefore India's development today is largely a result of the history of economic planning that we have undertaken after independence. In that sense also, when we will try to evaluate the economic performances of the country in terms of different indicators, coming from different development approaches, a discussion on India's development experiment as well as India's development experience is very important in terms of looking at the different outcomes of India's planning. And that is why we have included this discussion in this course, and we hope that this will provide a kind of background to understand what was the context of India's planning and how India's development today can be seen in terms of the planning efforts that we have made since independence. So we have outlined this discussion in 4 broad agendas. The first part, we will discuss about the general theoretical understanding of state interventions in the economy. Or in a sense, we will try to see the rationale of state intervention in the economy. In the second part, we will discuss economic planning as a specific form of state intervention. That this is a particular form in which the state would try to intervene in the economy and influence the performance and outcome. In the third part, we will like to discuss the major goals of economic planning in India and its unique features. And in the last part, we will try to sort of put forward a context for examining the India's development in terms of planning in India. Now let me come to the first part of this discussion. That is the understanding the rationale of state intervention in economy. Now let us begin with the primary objective of development when we discussed this in the first video. And we have agreed sort of in this discussion that the idea of development basically relates to the quality of life of people, and therefore objective of any development exercise is to improve the conditions of people. That is, conditions of everyone. Improvement in at least one will also denote development. Now herein comes the question of Pareto optimum. And we know from the theory that Pareto optimum is a condition where it is not possible to improve anyone without harming others. That is, it denotes a kind of best possible arrangement giving the best possible condition. So that's the condition of Pareto optimum. So in development exercise, the attempts will be made to improve the condition of people in such a way, such improvement in condition of some people will not, sort of affect adversely the conditions of other people. So we will look for some sort of Pareto optimum, some sort of best possible arrangement for best possible condition. Neoclassical economics suggests that the competitive equilibrium is also Pareto optimum. That is, that if we allow market to operate freely, it is the ideal thing, and this is the ideal condition, this is the ideal institution, and therefore there is no intervention that is required to have some kind of outcome or some kind of influence. So therefore, in a sense, the competitive equilibrium is also Pareto optimum. That's the standard neoclassical theory that would probably highlight or emphasize the necessity of free market as an institution for getting development outcomes. Now, it is important here is to understand that Pareto optimality in fact represents a kind of efficiency. It is the best possible outcome in terms of production and consumption. In production, you have utilized the resources in a way that would give the best production, optimum production, and you have consumed the things. This is a mix of different commodities which will give you the maximum satisfaction. So therefore, it is a kind of situation where efficiency underscores everything, that this is actually the most efficient allocation in terms of factors, in terms of inputs, or in terms of commodities, that would probably result the best or maximum, the outcome. That's either profit or the satisfaction. Now the question comes here that whether this Pareto optimality is consistent and compatible with distributional justice, that is the equity. We have a whole bunch of economics where this question is studied and this question is examined in some detail. And for instance, Robert Nozick, John Rawls, Amartya Sen, they are highly influenced by this question. Their engagement with this question gives a lot of useful insights and literature that are being followed up by different economists. And in all these discussions, we have agreed a sort of consensus that it requires a set of assumptions, that it can be compatible in some sense. Pareto optimum can produce efficiency along with equity, provided we have a set of assumptions that the perfect competition of the market, set of prices for the commodities and services reflecting preferences, and we can have the complete ordering of the preferences, and we should not have any externality, so on and so forth. So therefore, the 2 points are very clear, that it represents, the Pareto optimum represents efficiency provided a set of assumptions are fulfilled, and also it is also important to see whether that Pareto optimum is also consistent and compatible with the idea of distributional justice. So these are the two kind of concerns so far the market operation or market as an institution we would like to examine. Now, it also generates a question that can market always serve as an ideal, or whether there are cases of market failure. And we have seen in the theory that market failure indeed can emerge as the primary rationale for state intervention. That suppose the market is Pareto optimum, providing the best possible conditions, best possible mix, and best possible outcome, provided a set of assumptions are fulfilled, and then only we can get all these desired results. So therefore, the first condition that is required, that we have to fulfill the set of assumptions that we have taken. And the second, of course, the question was that whether this Pareto optimum is also compatible and consistent with the distributional justice. And then we have seen that market failure can emerge as the primary rationale. And this is because that there can be a non-existent market. For instance, you cannot have market for everything. And that is what is called non-existent market. And that is precisely the situation in a very underdeveloped or undeveloped economy, where market is very incipient, market is not really grown, and therefore not everything can be provided through the institution of market. So there is a non-existent market. And also you can have market, but it is imperfect, it is not perfect. All sorts of imperfection can be there in the market. And that will compromise a kind of Pareto optimality, that if you have a market which is not perfect, which is not fulfilling the kind of conditions and assumptions that we have taken, then we will have not Pareto optimality, but rather Pareto suboptimality. It will operate quite suboptimally. And for non-existent market, the question of Pareto optimality simply does not arise. Then we have a kind of situation where individual behavior and hence preferences deviate from the usual rationality assumptions. For instance, suppose you have a condition for adverse selection. Now, adverse selection is a condition where the people prefer, or if people express their choices for certain things not based on full information. So that's adverse selection. Then the moral hazards. Moral hazard is something that you are not rationally behaving because of certain conditions. So therefore, these are the situations. Free rider, for instance. So these are the situations where the individual behavior or preference or choice can deviate from the rationality assumption. And also, when there is a public good, the goods which are equally consumed by different people, that consumption of this good by one person does not exclude the consumption of the same good by the other person. So that these are the public good property. And then you have a huge requirement of public good. So therefore, market cannot actually provide that. And that is precisely was the condition during the immediately after the independence, that you need a lot of public goods, the physical and social infrastructures. So therefore, the market can fail under certain situation when the non-existent market is there, the market is imperfect, individual behavior deviates from rationality assumption, public good provisioning is required. So under such conditions, you can actually provide a justification for correcting the failure that is coming from the market, and that can be done by state intervention. And also, market cannot provide always the equity, that is the distributional justice. So distributional justice or equity concerns can also be advanced as justification for state intervention. So theoretically, the rationale for state intervention or justification for state intervention can come from two things. One is the market failure, when we do not have fulfillment of the assumptions, usual assumptions for Pareto optimality through market, and also for the distributional justice perspective. So these are the two conditions within which we can actually theorize a kind of rationale for state intervention in the economy. Now, how do state actually intervene? All right? And how do you see this state intervention? So we would like to see planning as a form of state intervention. In a sense, if you look at the market failure argument or the distributional justice argument, the justification for state intervention makes state endogenous. Endogenous means within the system. It is very much part of the system. In typical neoclassical economics, state remains exogenous entity. It is outside the economic sphere. It does not interfere with the sphere, in economic sphere. So therefore, the state becoming endogenous and thereby influencing the behavior of economic agents and also the economic outcomes is something which is very important to understand. And when we have that, the question therefore comes that how does state become endogenous? How does it influence the economic behavior of agents and also the economic outcomes? It is by controlling different resources, it is by setting goals and targets, it is by directing savings and investment, it is by deciding the priorities, it is by allocating resources to different sectors, and also by incentivizing economic actions of individual economic agents. So this is how state can become endogenous. It can influence the behavior of economic agents and also influence the economic outcomes. So therefore, all these things requires an institution, and that is the institution of planning. You can, through plan, you can actually set goals and targets, decide the priority, direct saving and investment, control over resources, allocate resources, and incentivize different actions. So therefore, all these activities can be done by economic planning, and therefore the economic planning is an institution where we would like to have the state intervention as an endogenous intervention, and this is what was the argument, that planning as a form of state intervention. Now let me come to the next part of this discussion, that is planning in India. Now, economic planning was envisioned as a part of development strategy for independent India, and this was a part of the national movement of India also. In the national movement, Indian National Congress, different business groups and individuals tried to sort of visualize that how after independence the India would look like. What will be the trajectory of development that India would like to pursue? So this was, the discussion, and in that discussion, the economic planning was very much envisioned as an integral part of development strategy, and it was by the Congress, it was by different business groups, and also by individuals. So therefore, you have some elements of economic planning as a development strategy even before the India got independence. Now, if you look at the history, then two things actually inspired planning as a development strategy. One was, of course, the Soviets' experience. Soviet used a socialist and communist form of governance, and this planning in Soviet was tried around 1928. So therefore, there was a case in point where planning was exercised. And also, we had the experience of Great Depression in 1930s that led to kind of Keynesian economics where state intervention was seen as a panacea. So therefore, you have two experiences. One was the Soviets' experience with planning, and an experience of Great Depression giving rise to Keynesian kind of economics where we have a greater role of state in order to sort of direct the economic development and overcome the shortcomings of the market. So this was very much there. In this context, the first kind of thing that was there in the discussion was coming from Sir Visvesvaraya. Visvesvaraya was an engineer statesman, and then he proposed an economic plan for India with a goal of doubling the national income in 10 years. And his focus was on industrialization. He produced this planned economy for India, a book in 1934. And this was the first discussion on economic planning as a development strategy in the country. And that was, the background was a late 1920s Soviet experience of planning, and also the experience of the Great Depression followed by Keynesianism. So he was the first person who suggested planning as something which is necessary for the independent India. And then it was also a very much part of the discussion in the India's national movement, where a national planning committee under the chairmanship of Jawaharlal Nehru was constituted within the National Congress when Subhas Bose was the president in 1938. And there were three major thrusts in this committee regarding the economic planning, and it suggested that to end poverty and to improve condition of the living masses, and to attain the national self-sufficiency, we need to have planning. And it focused on industrialization, particularly on heavy and capital good industries, and it envisaged a dominant role of the state. And it has, how do you do that? By establishing a large public sector. So this was the idea of the National Planning Committee, which was a part of the Indian National Congress. Now in 1944, we have a group of industrialists from Bombay, J.R.D. Tata, Purushottam Das Thakurdas, G.D. Birla, produced an economic plan for India known as the Bombay Plan. And they have the vision of doubling the per capita income of India in next 15 years. And this is required, according to them, for ensuring minimum requirements for life of people. And they have fixed the minimum requirement of life as 2,800 kilocalorie daily diet, clothing of 30 yards per person, housing of 100 square feet per person, access to some amount of education and healthcare, and so on and so forth. And they advocated the balanced economic development, and also, they have said that the protection of domestic market is essential if we want to develop the Indian capitalist class and Indian industries. After that, 1944, SN Agrawal, he produced a kind of a Gandhian plan for economic development of India. He talked about decentralized planning based on Gandhian idea of self-sufficient villages. He also advocated least amount of state control, and he was, contrary to heavy industry, he was focusing on the small-scale industries and agriculture, the economic equality and freedom. And he said, very importantly, that you can have three things in this exercise. One is nationalism, the second one is democracy, and third one is livelihood. And he has taken the Nazi, that is a German, Russian and American experiences with all these things, that they cannot provide actually answers to all these three. And only Gandhian can be an alternative, providing all three together. I think that's the main point of this Gandhian plan. And 1 year after, M.N. Roy, the left leader, provided a sort of plan for 10-year plan for the country in 1945, and then he sort of focused on collectivization and state industrialization, and he also talked about nationalization of land. So therefore, in a sense, that planning in India was very much part of the national movement, and also a kind of a vision of a post-independence India. And that was there for about 20 years or so. And it actually caught the imagination of the leaders and also the popular public, and then seeing that planning is necessary, and that provided some idea regarding what kind of plan is actually required. So you have a recipe ready when you have independence for planning in India. And accordingly, that you have actually plan in India after the independence. And it actually important to realize that post-colonial Indian state and institution of planning in India are intrinsically interconnected. If you look at the constitution, then you will see that the post-colonial Indian state was envisaged as sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic with justice, liberty and equality as core principles. And you have to also look at the conditions of the country at the time of independence and objective reality of the people. That you have mass poverty, you have mass illiteracy, you have huge rural-urban divide, there is a lack of facilities in terms of basic amenities, majority of people are requiring those facilities. At the same time, you have an economy which is completely destroyed by 200 years of colonial rule. There is no capitalist class, there is lack of saving, income is abysmally poor. So you have a nation to rebuild, and that's one. And at the same time, you have to fulfill the aspirations of the people, and these peoples are your citizens, the legitimate citizens as per the constitution. So therefore you have two things together. One, you have to rebuild the country which is destroyed by hundreds of years of colonial exploitation, and at the same time you have to fulfill the aspirations of the people who are legitimate citizens of the country. you have an Article 21 guarantees their right to life with all necessary conditions of human being. So therefore, it is necessary to use the best possible use of the limited resources. And that's where the efficiency criteria will come in. Pareto optimality condition will chip in, and also to address the visible socio-economic, rural, urban, the kind of regional inequalities are there, and then you have to address that also. So equity concerns are there, and in fact, the equity concerns are very much part of the directive principles of the state policy in the Constitution. Article 38, 39 specifically talks about addressing these inequalities. So therefore, the planning in India was to fulfill these twin requirements of efficiency and equity. So therefore, not only the equity was important, efficiency was also important, and efficiency along with equity was the requirement of the day. And with this idea, the institution of planning was institutionalized in India by setting up a planning commission in 1950 with a first plan in 1951. Now, most importantly, it is to be understood that this planning commission was established by a resolution of the government. So it was an executive decision with Prime Minister as the chairperson, so that you can actually coordinate with different ministries and so on and so forth, and with two roles. One is the advisory role and other one is the allocative role. So you have to advise what is best for the economy and also to allocate different resources to different sectors and different states and so on and so forth. So this is very important. Now, if you look at the overarching goals for planning in India, then of course you have that it was providing a transformative vision from poverty to prosperity and also to self-reliance. And you can have the backdrop of famines in the 40s. So therefore, having enough food for people was important. In a sense, the achieving economic growth, that is improving the condition of people by ending poverty, and also resources to the series of welfare programs were necessary. This means that you need growth, production of goods and services to take care of the needs of large majority of people so that their poverty can end. And growth can also generate resources to the state in terms of taxes, indirect, direct, so that you can have enough fund for launching different welfare programs. So the growth was necessary for people. At the same time, it is necessary for the government. And then achieving equity and social justice, ideas of balanced growth and later on inclusive growth came in a big way. And that needed a functioning democracy. Functioning democracy means that you have a system in place where political equality was established through single vote on a society where social and economic inequalities are very large. So therefore, planning had a larger goal in terms of social and equity, social justice and equity to make this democracy work, so that democracy, political equality can actually work when we address this social and economic inequality. And social and economic inequality can be addressed through planning. So that's the kind of plan. And then very importantly, to facilitate modernization of the economy from within. And that required a kind of a support and protection to different sectors, and essentially delinking the Indian economy from the world economy in certain sense. Now we have to remember that there are uniqueness in this India's experiment with planning. The first uniqueness is that this is a democratic planning. So what you have in Soviet, the planning is actually centralized planning, but at the same time, it is dominated by a system which is communism. There is no democracy as such. And in democracy, you do not have evidences of planning as such. So therefore, this was the first example or first experiment where we have actually tried democracy with planning, and this is very unique to Indian experiment. And very term of 5 years for planning is very illustrative in a sense. It provided a sort of popular legitimacy that whether this government is doing right or wrong. It is actually coincided with the election or term of the government. So therefore, when we talk about the mixed economy, then when we have this private and public sector coexistence, it also reflects a kind of an ideological mix regarding this liberal democracy principles and also the centralized planning. So that is the result of this public-private coexistence. Unlike the centralized planning, India's economic planning is decentralized. So you have state and local the counterparts, and it required extensive negotiations and consultations. So therefore, it is a decentralized democratic way. It also reflected the nature of the state, welfare state, distributive justice is the main concern, and therefore you have to have a relative autonomy of the state. And planning commission was seen as something which is instrumental in providing that relative autonomy to the state. Rather than political leaders, the planning commission tried to use the technocratic persons, individuals, to decide upon these things so that these political influences does not come into play. So this was a kind of unique experience in India's experiment with the planning. Now finally, if you have in 1990s, you have a context of globalization, challenges to sovereignty and autonomy of the state was there, because not necessarily all economic decisions are taken within the state. These are also influenced by international events, international institutions, and international directives. So therefore, you can plan only when you have a full command over everything. You have a command on the resources, you can set target, you can pursue certain things, but increasing privatization and liberalization along with globalization, India lost that kind of a control, and therefore economic decisions are no longer fully dependent on internal decisions. At the same time, increasing privatization also downsized the public sector to a large extent. So therefore, in a situation of this changing context, the planning was no longer feasible, and then finally we had to abandon this whole idea of planning. And in 2014, and this institution of planning commission was replaced by a new institution called NITI Aayog on January 1st, 2015. Now, basic difference between NITI Aayog and erstwhile planning commission comes from its role. The NITI Aayog is an advisory body. It has an advisory role. It does not have an allocative role. Planning commission has an allocative role. So this has made a huge implication for democratic decentralization in general and decentralized planning in particular. So therefore, we will discuss this part in more detail in subsequent videos, and we will see how these things are very important to understand the overall environment of development in the country. So friends, let us sum up this whole discussion for this today. We have 5 major points to sum up. Planning for Development in India was an attempt with twin objectives: growth and social justice. It was a unique experience in a sense that it combined economic planning with ideals and principles of liberal political democracy. Planning was necessary for rebuilding the newly independent country and also to fulfill popular aspirations of citizens. Planning was conditioned by full autonomy and control over the decisions. Changing context and situation demanded that planning is no longer feasible, so you have to abandon. So therefore, it is very important to understand that objective of economic planning was not limited to economic sphere alone. It was actually extended to a larger social and political goals, and that is the goal of establishing economic as well as social and political equality. So therefore, when we try to evaluate the plan experiences in our subsequent module, we will also try to see not only in terms of economic performances, but planning exercise should be seen as something with this larger goal, that whether planning was successful not only in terms of providing economic growth and economic prosperity, but also in terms of making this social and political equality to a large extent, so that this democracy can actually function. So therefore, within this broad framework, this whole idea of planning is to be evaluated when we talk about planning for development in India. With this, I come to end of this video. Thank you very much.